Hi everyone, Mark here, Planning Account Director at equimedia, bringing you the fourth session in our Digital Futures Now series. This session is looking at ePrivacy, transparency, and therefore consumer trust. You'll be hearing from myself, along with guest speaker Eitan from Sheridans, and we'll be discussing not just ePrivacy, but also what the introduction and enforcement of the Children's Code in September this year means for all businesses, and how using people's data and their privacy can ultimately lead to gaining their trust and being able to work with them in the best way possible. I hope you enjoy the session, but of course, please use the hashtag #DigitalFuturesNow on Twitter and share with us any thoughts and live updates that you might have. I hope you enjoy. I'm here today as part of our Digital Futures Now sessions to talk to you about ePrivacy and how we can use ePrivacy to gain trust and build trust with consumers. I've been at equimedia for about 7 months now, having previously worked here, and have about 10 years experience in digital marketing. Now over that time, privacy and online privacy has been a growing trend, and rightly so. It's very important, and we can't do anything online without seeing things like cookie banners on websites or targeted ads. Now, there are people in the world far more knowledgeable on the subject than I am to talk about these things. So that's why I would like to introduce Eitan from Sheridans, who will be our guest on the session today, to talk through where we are at the moment with ePrivacy laws. Eitan.
Thanks, Mark. My name's Eitan. I'm the head of Sheridan's privacy and technology team. I do a lot of my work in the areas of online advertising, performance marketing, and a lot of our clients are making a lot of use of personal data, and so we're helping them navigate any particular regulation that may apply to them, and hopefully allowing them to do what it is they want to achieve for their business, but in a compliant way.
So there are two topics that we're going to be talking through today. First off being ePrivacy, second one being the Age-Appropriate Design Code. So as I say, Eitan, you'll know far more about these than I do, but we'll start off with ePrivacy and then we'll go into the Age-Appropriate Design Code after. As is the point of Digital Futures, we'll be talking about what you need to be doing to get yourself prepared for these things, but also be coming away with 3 takeouts of what you need to do right now to make yourself be best prepared for the changes. ePrivacy. I have seen ePrivacy around for many years now. Back in my previous role client side, it was spoken about a lot with the launch of GDPR, and nonetheless, it's not something really that I've seen very much of more recently. So, Eitan, are you able to give us an update of exactly what's happened there? Why have we maybe not seen ePrivacy come into its full potential or into full fruition over the past few years?
So ePrivacy is something which is kind of like a companion to laws which relate to data protection. And so on the one hand, you've got GDPR and before that, the Data Protection Act, 1998 in the UK. And that's about protecting people's right to a private life. ePrivacy is more about protecting their right to privacy in their own communications. So in the analogy being, in an offline world, it stops people from reading your post. And GDPR came along to harmonize what was a very fragmented setup across all of the EU, because the last law was created by the EU instructing member states to make their own laws along certain lines. It meant there were slight differences in the way that those laws were implemented, and that caused a lack of harmonization across Europe. And as the economy evolved, I mean, bearing in mind that the original Data Protection Act, 1998, was effectively pre-internet. I mean, I think when there was something like 10,000 websites at all when that wording was finalized. And so GDPR comes along to try to harmonize all of that and does so by creating one law that just applies to everybody. And even with Brexit, the UK has maintained effectively the same legal framework. ePrivacy currently is fragmented the way data protection used to be. And so it was originally intended that there would be a new harmonized version of ePrivacy laws that would come along at the same time as GDPR, and that just didn't happen. And the deadline has slipped and slipped. And so we do currently have ePrivacy laws. They're different in each member state. and also obviously the UK, now that we're outside of the EU. And the current draft law for ePrivacy is seeking to do what GDPR did, create one set of rules for everyone. And it's relevant because there's a huge overlap with data protection, because ePrivacy deals a lot with cookies. And of course, cookies count as personal data under GDPR in a lot of cases.
So I guess one of the overriding themes there that you touched on, Eitan, was harmonisation. So what we're really saying here is that ePrivacy coming in is a positive step, but not just for a consumer, because for the consumer, they can be hopefully more trusting that their data is going to be used in the right way, but also for businesses. What we're saying here is that GDPR is potentially launched, made some of the waters a little bit murky because it should have joined things up, maybe hasn't achieved that. So is that what we're looking for here? Is ePrivacy to be a positive step for both businesses and consumers?
Regulatory certainty is always important. Not knowing what the law actually means makes it difficult to comply with, makes a job like mine as a lawyer, next to impossible. And when any new law comes in, you've got different kind of elements to it. There's the law itself in its pure written form. Then it's the way those words are interpreted. And then it's the approach that regulators take to enforcing that law as it's interpreted. And so for GDPR, we still haven't yet seen exactly how the interpretation works, although there's constant guidance coming out clarifying these things at both the UK level and an EU level. We don't have much body of law in terms of cases, and there's been fairly light enforcement so far by the regulator. So those are things we will continue to learn. It may ultimately take 10 years before everyone says that we're really comfortable with exactly what GDPR means. ePrivacy, we know, is coming. It already exists because we have this kind of pre-harmonized version, as I mentioned earlier, one set of rules in each country that are broadly similar but not identical. And so the harmonization will be kind of complete at a sort of legislative level when ePrivacy comes along and harmonizes all that fragmented ePrivacy part. And so GDPR is offering the majority of the rules that companies dealing with online ads and whatnot need to think about. And then there's this last, let's say, 20% that comes from ePrivacy. But as mentioned, currently the ePrivacy laws do exist. They're being revised. It's kind of worth saying here, actually, that what GDPR does is it lends, in a way, wording to the existing ePrivacy frameworks. And so by that I mean, when in a cookie context it says obtain consent, most laws in Europe would say consent means whatever consent means under GDPR when we talk about cookies. And so when GDPR came along, even though we already had this idea of consent, that meaning changed. And so GDPR effectively kind of retrofits this new definition, which changes the law, it changes what everyone has to do, it changes consumers' experience online, and even without ePrivacy having changed currently. And so the new law will smooth out all of those bumps and wrinkles, is the idea, yeah.
And another thing you've mentioned a couple of times is cookies. So there's a lot of conversation going on at the moment around the cookieless future. That's mainly referring to advertising cookies and the way that cookies are therefore being able to be utilized to target people. But it's probably worth touching on here about the fact that cookies will remain in other instances. So with ePrivacy and cookies, Eitan, is there anything that we need to be aware of there? What cookies can we expect to still be seeing on websites, for example?
First of all, cookies now require consent, and the consent, the way of obtaining consent is quite strictly described. So in order to validly obtain consent, to get a good consent, you have to do it a certain way in the GDPR. And as I mentioned, because the consent definition is now borrowed from GDPR and stuck into our existing ePrivacy rules, you have to do it for cookies as cookies, but also as personal data. And so different frameworks have popped up, and the predominant one is the IAB's TCF, now in version 2. We don't yet know what the regulator thinks of that. And by that I mean we don't yet know if the way that framework obtains and transmits consent is something which the regulator would agree is compliant with the standards necessary for a good consent under GDPR. So that's the first question. There's been from the regulator an investigation into ad tech which happened in 2019, and they're examining in particular RTB. And clearly in RTB is an open ecosystem. There's a huge supply chain. It's not even a chain, it's kind of like a sort of web. And everyone is passing information between themselves, and they're also now distributing or sharing consents with each other. One company is obtaining consent for intermediary vendors and things like that. Publishers tend to be required to do that. Because of the pandemic, well, what happened right before the pandemic hit, the regulator was said, we're not happy with some of these things. But they didn't specify much on the way consents were currently being obtained. It looked like they were about to start beginning a process of enforcement, and then the pandemic hit, and so the regulator basically gave everyone a pass because we've all got enough to deal with. But increasingly, we understand that they will begin to bring that back, and so that initial enforcement work is likely to begin to start. I would say probably this year. I don't know that for sure. It's just the sense I get from the various pieces of information I'm able to kind of cobble together. And so that's one thing which is applying pressure to cookies. It's, can you get consent for cookies when you need to get consent for God knows how many controllers, or even controllers you don't necessarily know yet, because RTB, the way it works, is, and the fact that it's an open system and it's so widely used, could be any one of, hundreds of participants in that ecosystem. And then so that's one pressure on cookies. Separately, there's a pressure on by companies, principally Apple and Google, who are taking steps both on web and in app, and they're effectively winding in any support for third-party cookies used for profiling in advertising. We can hypothesize about why they're doing that. Apple, being not fundamentally a data business, seems to be doing that for privacy reasons. I don't know that for sure, that's just the sense I get. And Google, again, just my own view, would seem to be doing it because it would allow it to leverage its already strong position in the market. But those are the two main forces that are being applied to cookies at the moment, but that doesn't mean that cookies will stop being around at all. For a start, there's a lot less pressure on first-party cookies. A lot of online advertising businesses, a lot of ad tech businesses are working more closely with first parties. The first party is then taking care of the cookie, so it's represented as a first-party cookie. And also from the consent point of view, a lot of cookies are consented very straightforward. And in a lot of cases, from a regulatory point of view, you don't actually need consent if it's strictly necessary. So cookies to do things like remember what's in your basket, that's the classic example of a cookie that doesn't require consent. And so no, I will continue to see cookies and other similar technologies, but mostly it's this pressure on third-party cookies which are being used to build profiles of behavior and interest of consumers, which is then used to target ads, so they can be addressed in what we hope is a more relevant way.
So just to summarize on ePrivacy, what we're looking at, Eitan, is something that already exists, be looking now to potentially be getting enforced more, and that in turn should be able to allow businesses to potentially change the way they're doing things to in turn build trust with their consumers if they're able to leverage those consent platforms in the right way. So how do we build trust with consumers in this environment where consent and explicit consent is such a big thing? I guess what it maybe boils down to when we talk about things like the long list of providers that we see when we give consent on websites to track our cookies, does it boil down to essentially treating people like adults, treating people like grown-ups, and giving them the information that they need so they are able to act within their own interests?
I think that it does. I think that we've reached a kind of an inflection point, and it's probably being instigated by GDPR. Zuckerberg can go to a congressional hearing and say, we're one of the biggest companies on earth and our product is free. What do our users think is happening? I don't think that they're thinking about that particular thing. I think they're going on there to see what their mates are up to and to shop and to go and attend badminton classes or whatever. Fundamentally, the internet has been built in a certain way. It's predominantly ad-funded. Advertising is increasingly targeted and personalized. There's a value exchange happening there. People may not be aware, but what they're participating in is a swap. They obtain services and they give away information about themselves, and they also give away their attention. At that point, a company is then able to say, right, this person is looking and we know what they're into, and I'm able to take that opportunity and serve an ad to them, and perhaps they'll buy something and we'll all make some money. There's no real inherent objection to ad funding things. I think the question is the extent to which personal data is needed in order to serve those ads. What is the marginal benefit of a targeted ad based on an individual's interest and behavior against the targeting you can do by the context of the ad? Matching the ad to the content the individuals really come there to see. People don't surf the internet to see a banner ad. I think that's a kind of a key question. It's something that I expect people will become increasingly aware of, and perhaps they'll object to it, perhaps they won't, and perhaps they'll want to be a part of it themselves. The cost of information about consumers can be surprisingly high. It may be that individuals are willing to sell their own data, and perhaps they want to be a part of that value exchange in a more direct way. Perhaps they want to be able to sell to multiple insurance companies the date on which their car insurance expires. Insurance companies basically get one shot to sell you your car insurance every 10 months, and they want to make sure that ads are in front of you at the right time. And so perhaps an individual will say, you know what, it's expiring 1st of September, and I'm up for being targeted with insurance ads in August, and I might even get a better deal with some price comparison type thing going on. I might even get paid for it. The concept already exists with things like cashback. To people who are, habitual users of cashback sites, they tend to understand it. They tend to understand that commission is being shared with them. Slightly different to RTB because it's based on CPA, so they have to actually complete. I do think that there's an education piece there. I think people may take more interest in these matters, and they may begin to see opportunities for themselves. I don't think the value exchange is a bad thing. I just think that no one seems to really know that they're part of that trade. And then once they become aware, perhaps that will lend itself to more opportunities for consumers, for marketers, for publishers.
So what we're really saying is to build trust, funnily enough, just try and be honest with people. Bring those things into the open. Let them know what they're getting themselves into. Give them an open choice and then be able to build trust with them.
Yeah, I think the key principles of a law like GDPR is transparency and accountability. Regulators and legislators are very reluctant to boss people around too much. There may be policy reasons why you can't sell your kidney, but there shouldn't be anything to stop you from selling your data, I don't think. The regulation provides that if everyone knows what's going on and they agree to it, then we're all grown-ups. We can do that. We can have our data processed by another company. If we've consented to it, why would the regulator step in there? The issue is that historically, the information was buried in a link at the bottom of the page below a privacy policy link. It was very difficult to understand. Consent was implied. You would, as a lawyer, before GDPR, very commonly put in a privacy policy, which no one reads, is not brought to anyone's attention, and somewhere buried within it, it says, by using our website, you consent to all the stuff we're about to do. Is that a real consent? Probably not. They don't know they're giving it. And that's what GDPR is trying to do. It's like, okay, you can be grown-ups, but we still need to protect people because we need to make sure that when they do give consent, they know what they're consenting to. And that's why consent needs to be freely given, specific, informed, and revocable. These are all things which empower the individual so that when they do decide to go along with the data processing, they're happy, they understand why it's good for them. Maybe they're just doing it because they want to support the publisher or something. They're doing it knowingly. That's really the thrust of it. And that is about transparency and sharing information. And hopefully I would like to see the public take an interest in how the internet actually works, considering we're all so dependent on it, and consider what implications it may have for them.
Next, Eitan, if we can move on and start to discuss the age-appropriate design code. Again, you'll know far more about this than I do. My understanding on this is that we're looking at 1 in 5 internet users being a child. That is a vast amount of people that are going across websites, looking at these cookie banners and potentially giving permissions to cookie IDs being children. Now, please, can you tell us a little bit about the age-appropriate design code that's looking to be coming into force in September of this year?
So the age-appropriate design code, which is now becoming referred to as a children's code, and it's about making sure that when people design online services or connected devices, they are doing so in a way which reflects people's age and is appropriate for them. It's a statutory code, so it's kind of more elevated than a typical code you might see from a regulator like the ICO. It came into law as law September last year. in September of this year, it starts to come into force. There's a grace period of 12 months. It's the first of its kind globally, and it's kind of setting the standard in a way. In the US, there are laws to protect children's data, but they are more specifically about websites which are directed to children, whereas the age-appropriate design code is more about websites which are likely to be accessed by a child. So it's much broader in its application. It contains a number of principles which businesses need to take into account. It's more principles-based, so it's not do's and don'ts so much. It's things that people need to be aware of and take into consideration when they're designing products and services that are likely to be accessed by a child.
So, Eitan, will all websites need to be considerate of this code coming into place and be potentially setting themselves up to adhere to those guides, those policies?
So it's, as I mentioned, it's broader than this definition we've seen in other laws internationally, where they were limited to services which were directed to children. So it's CBeebies, bad example because the BBC doesn't have much advertising in the UK, but that type of thing. Whereas this is things that are likely to be accessed by a child. And at its broadest interpretation, that would be anything which doesn't prevent minors from accessing. So, for example, an online casino wouldn't permit under 18-year-olds, and therefore they don't have to comply with this because it's not likely to be accessed by a child. But if it's just a general purpose website for, the British public to access and see, then they would need to be considering whether this applies to them, and it may well. Because of that broad interpretation, it's kind of elevating GDPR even higher. And in the UK at least. And it means things like, the implications of that are things like you should expect that location tracking, for example, should be off by default, unless there's a compelling reason not to have it off. Those types of considerations, also for profiling. You should assume that profiling isn't permitted or isn't appropriate for your audience because there may be children there, unless there is a compelling reason to do that. And so what we're kind of waiting to see is the way industry goes about understanding its customer base and the way it goes about presenting itself kind of differently to its users based on what it knows of their age.
Okay, so although we're talking about the age-appropriate design code or becoming the child protection code, what that really in turn will be doing is leveling up data privacy for all users, because websites would be starting to work on the basis that this could be a child, therefore we must do things differently.
Yeah, that's effectively it. The children code is kind of sweeping a lot of the general web up together because so much of it is likely to be accessed by a child. A child is anyone under the age of 18. And yeah, as you can imagine, 16, 17-year-olds have very similar interests to people who are 19, 20. And in a lot of cases, you would find that a general website is going to be expected to have considered this when designing its products and services. And the same for connected devices or other things like that.
Ethan, you've said there that the code isn't necessarily a list of do's and don'ts. So my question to you is, will the code make a difference? Will it impact? Because are there potentially some murky areas there, like we've seen with previous things like GDPR, where people don't necessarily know exactly what they have to do, so things may not change?
The code will make a difference. It will change what the regulator views as compliance under GDPR and other laws. And even though it's principles based and it's not explicit, that's just because they want to try to future-proof it. If they were to make very rigid rules about this is okay and this is not, then people like me would probably try and game them and work out ways around them. Principles-based laws are generally to allow for interpretation and complying with the spirit of what was intended here. And so no, it would make a difference. Again, that difference will be felt when enforcement starts, and that will, even though there's been a 12-month implementation period, that will always take a little bit of time. And as we're seeing from GDPR, which is over 3 years old now, so it will ultimately change. It will change practices and change the way people go about their business. Yeah.
Okay, so the whole premise of the sessions, of course, are to talk about things we need to prepare for in the future, but also to be giving some information on exactly what people, consumers, businesses, anyone should be doing right now to prepare for these things. So On that note, Eitan, are you able to give us 3 key takeouts for what people should be doing right now if they are concerned about either ePrivacy or the age-appropriate design code and gearing themselves up for any changes?
Okay, so the 3 things I would focus on are the implications of the ICO's investigation into ad tech, specifically RTB. There is some communication coming out of the ICO. They do blog posts and things like that, which I think are quite accessible, even if you don't have much of a legal or technical background. So I would be aware of those.
And you can get those, Eitan, just from the ICO website, right? They have a blog there.
Yeah, you can get those from the ICO website, and they're short and they're pretty clear. I mean, the ICO doesn't. It wants to make this stuff as accessible as possible. In fairness to the ICO, they're looking for outcomes. They're not trying to come up with a load of things no one understands and then trip companies up. They actually want companies to engage with people's personal data in a way which is, it's what's okay under GDPR. They want good privacy behaviors in the industries. So that would be the first thing. Second thing is keep an eye on ePrivacy. As we mentioned, there's already ePrivacy. It's already kind of got this consent requirement. That consent requirement is already the GDPR standard. The new ePrivacy actually in some ways makes it kind of easier because there are additional exceptions to the requirement to obtain consent. And so for things like audience measurement and whatnot. And so question there is whether the exception for measurement would extend also to advertising, not just website users, and whether that can be done on an aggregated basis or on a per user basis. Because if you're able to, if you're able to measure advertising performance, then affiliate marketing starts to look more appealing, because that's basically what that is, right? Affiliate marketing tracking can't be about the advertising, because what you're tracking is the event that's happened after the advertisement is served. It's really a measurement process of measurement. How effective was this ad in terms of the revenue it generated? And affiliate marketing tracking is typically done on a per transaction level, not per user but per transaction. But it could also be done on a per publisher level, in which case you're starting to aggregate things. And so even if measurement is only permitted in aggregated form, you could still do a form of performance marketing and effectively, consider your ad budget part of your cost of sale. That'd be the second one. Third one is to consider, and this is something I think people should be looking at now, is consider the principles of the age-appropriate design code. Consider whether their particular service is likely to be caught in the scope, in the regulatory scope, which it probably is. This is this idea of likely to be accessed. Those are the key words there. Is a child likely to access this thing? And then look at those principles and see, how close you are to them, and make that kind of gap analysis between your current practices and ultimately the standard that will be asked of you by the regulator once this law comes into force.
Thanks very much for your time, Eitan. As always, very interesting talking to somebody that can make things like data privacy seem very simple, very interesting. So thank you for your time.
Thank you for having me.
We hope you've come out of the session knowing a bit more, but please do share any questions that you have with us using the Q&A speech bubble underneath the timeline bar below, and we'll plan on answering as many of the questions we can on our live roundtable at the end of the week. And of course, continue to join the conversation on Twitter using the hashtag #DigitalFuturesNow. Thanks, guys.